We are watched. Every moment we step into public, we are being evaluated not just by eyes, but by minds. Judged not merely for what we say, but for how we exist. And this truth isn't new. Over 500 years ago, Niccolo Machiavelli warned us, public life is never neutral. It is a battlefield. And if you do not understand the rules of perception, you will be devoured by appearances. This is not a game of authenticity. This is a game of survival. And in this game, there are 7 things you should never do in public, because once you do, you'll never recover the power you lost.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Machiavelli wasn't cold. He was honest. He knew the world is not fair, that virtue alone does not lead to victory. In The Prince, he wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." That sentence alone should stop you, because it means what people see matters more than what is true. And once you grasp that, your entire approach to life changes. This is about protecting your influence, your presence, your impact. The first thing you should never do in public is display weakness emotionally. Not because emotions are wrong, but because public perception is ruthless. When you cry in front of the wrong people, when you collapse, when you unravel without strategic control, you are handing over the script of your life to people who may not care. Machiavelli said, "A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men and to imitate those who have been supreme." The great men of history knew how to suffer without spectacle. They processed pain privately so they could lead publicly. Do you? There is a deep psychological principle here. People admire strength not because they want to dominate you, but because they want to feel safe around you. When you lose control in public, some may pity you, but many will lose respect for you. Not because they are cruel, but because you've broken the illusion that holds society together, the illusion that leaders are stable. So ask yourself when you're falling apart, do you seek a stage or a sanctuary? The second thing you should never do in public is overexplain yourself. The more you justify, the more you weaken your position. The more you try to prove your innocence, your intelligence, your intention, the more you appear unsure. Machiavelli warned, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Why? Because fear commands respect instantly. Love takes time, and in public, time is limited. When you overexplain, you are asking others to give you what they will not: empathy without earned authority. We think if people just understood us, they'd accept us. But in public, understanding is not the currency. Command is. Presence, precision, confidence. If you must defend yourself, do it with brevity. Let your actions speak. Let your silence speak louder. The man who talks too much in public reveals the cracks in his armor, and those cracks invite attack. The third thing you must never do is mock others publicly, especially those beneath you. The moment you punch down, you lose altitude. You reveal your insecurity. You show that you need to dominate to feel powerful. Machiavelli knew this, even as he wrote about power with brutal honesty. He said, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." Why? Because real leaders raise others. They don't humiliate. The man who must belittle others in public becomes small in the eyes of the wise. You might get applause from a crowd, but you will lose the loyalty of the room. Respect is not won by cruelty. It's won by restraint. And when you have the chance to destroy someone publicly but choose instead to elevate or say nothing, you demonstrate a kind of power that cannot be faked. Ask yourself, do you crave dominance or do you command dignity? The fourth mistake is revealing your strategy too early. In public, you must never show your full hand. Machiavelli was clear: never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception. This isn't about lying. It's about timing. The man who shows all his dreams, all his plans, all his vulnerabilities in public is not transparent, he's exposed. And exposure without leverage is suicide. People do not always want you to win. Some admire you, some envy you, and some are waiting for the first sign that they can copy, sabotage, or redirect your path. That's why the wise speak in layers. They reveal only what must be revealed. They understand that power is preserved in mystery. So ask yourself, are you sharing to connect, or are you bleeding for attention? The fifth thing to never do in public: argue. Not debate, not defend, but argue. The moment your voice rises, your logic collapses. The moment you get pulled into reactive energy, you're no longer in control, you're dancing to someone else's tune. Machiavelli wrote, "He who builds on the people builds on mud." This is not a judgment, it's a warning. The mob does not reward the calm voice of reason. It rewards spectacle. But spectacle is not power. It's distraction. When you argue in public, you become entertainment. Your credibility erodes. Even if you're right, you lose. Because the public doesn't remember the truth. They remember the tone. They remember the energy. They remember the image of you red-faced, trembling, defending something you should have stood above. The man who argues in public becomes a puppet. The man who stays calm becomes a pillar. The sixth danger is seeking validation. Approval is a drug, and public approval is the strongest dose. It feels good to be liked, to be cheered, to be praised. But Machiavelli warned, the promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. In politics, in power, in public life, loyalty is often an illusion. The crowd that cheers you today may turn on you tomorrow. So if your sense of self is built on their applause, it will collapse with their silence. The man who seeks validation in public gives away his center. He becomes addicted to perception and therefore manipulated by it. But the man who stands rooted in his own truth becomes immovable. You don't need to be cold. You don't need to be aloof, but you must be anchored. Anchored in something deeper than the noise, deeper than the metrics, deeper than the spotlight. Finally, the seventh sin in public: underestimate no one. Machiavelli said, "The wise man does at once what the fool does finally." That includes seeing danger where others see irrelevance. The man who dismisses others publicly, who laughs at the quiet one, who ignores the unseen, he is digging his own grave. Because power often comes from the unexpected, the underestimated, the invisible. In every room there is someone watching, listening, calculating. The person you think is irrelevant might one day hold the keys to your kingdom or the blade to your back. So treat everyone with dignity. Not because you are kind, but because you are wise. The public space is a chessboard, not a playground. Every move matters. Every glance, every word, every silence. Power is not claimed by accident. It is maintained by discipline. Now ask yourself, how many of these 7 things have you done in public this year? This month? This week? And what did they cost you, not in likes or followers, but in influence, in grace, in presence? We live in an age obsessed with visibility. But Machiavelli would remind us that visibility without strategy is suicide. That the man who wants power must first master himself. And that begins not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, in restraint, in silence, in the wisdom to hold back when every part of you wants to speak, to argue, to prove, to win. The moment you become aware that every public act is a declaration of strategy, your life begins to change. You start to notice what others miss. You start to see how people rise and fall not because of talent, but because of perception. And Machiavelli would urge you never forget, public failure is rarely due to lack of skill. It is almost always a failure of appearance, of timing, of understanding the theater of power. You are always on stage, even when you think no one is watching. Especially then. Let's revisit the first danger, showing emotional weakness. There's something seductive about being vulnerable today. We're told to be open, raw, real. But Machiavelli would ask, to what end? Vulnerability is not inherently virtuous. In public, it's a double-edged sword. It invites sympathy, yes, but also judgment. And judgment, in public, spreads faster than truth. A tear shown to the wrong audience becomes a weapon. A confession made without control becomes a liability. Think of the leaders who crumbled because they couldn't hold their center. Not because they were evil, but because they cracked under pressure in front of others. In private, you can break. In private, you can scream. But in public, you must learn the art of composure. You must learn to bleed inwardly. Because when you lose control in public, you give others permission to define your narrative. And once they control your story, they control you. Now the second, overexplaining. It's human to want to be understood. But Machiavelli would say being understood is not the same as being respected. When you overexplain, you signal doubt. You reveal that you're still trying to convince yourself. A powerful presence requires mystery. It requires the ability to say little and still command attention. Remember this, the more you talk, the more you shrink. Imagine standing before a crowd. You've made a bold statement. Someone challenges you. You feel the urge to explain, to soften, to justify. But instead, you pause. You say nothing. Or you say just one line, clean, clear, unapologetic. That silence becomes power. That restraint becomes unforgettable. People don't remember the perfect argument. They remember the energy. They remember who owned the moment. And ownership does not come from logic. It comes from presence. Bird mocking others. It's easy to laugh at someone's mistake, to roast, to ridicule, to dominate the weak. But Machiavelli would remind you, The injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. Public humiliation creates enemies. Silent correction creates loyalty. When you mock someone in front of others, you're not just hurting them, you're sending a message. I use people for power. And that message echoes long after the laughter, the lies. The wise man knows when to be sharp and when to be silent, when to correct and when to elevate. Praise someone in public, and you plant seeds of loyalty you won't even see until years later. Crush someone in public, and you might win applause in the moment, but you've made an enemy in the dark. Machiavelli knew today's nobody may become tomorrow's threat. So ask yourself, are you building allies or collecting enemies disguised as fans? Fourth, revealing strategy. The world rewards transparency in theory, but in reality, it punishes it. Every time you speak your next move, you give others time to react. You give rivals time to interfere. You give doubters time to sabotage. Machiavelli would say, the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. This means sometimes your silence is your strongest defense. Sometimes your ambiguity is your greatest weapon. In a world obsessed with sharing, with tweeting every thought, with documenting every decision, you must be the exception. Move in silence. Act in stillness. Let your results speak so loudly that people never saw it coming. Because when they don't see it coming, they can't stop it. And when they can't stop it, they start to respect it. Learn to be the fox. Learn to be the lion. But never show your claws until it's time to strike. If public arguments. One of the fastest ways to lose power is to get pulled into a reactive state. Arguments are rarely about truth. They are about dominance. And when you argue in public, you are stepping into someone else's frame. You are allowing them to dictate the tempo, the tone, the terrain. Machiavelli warned us, men in general judge more from appearances than from reality. Even if you win the argument logically, you might lose symbolically. Because the public doesn't remember who was right. They remember who looked rattled. Instead of arguing, learn to redirect, learn to pivot. Learn to speak in layered truths that don't require validation. A man who cannot be drawn into public quarrels is feared. He is respected. He is trusted. Because people sense he is not moved by emotion. He is rooted in something deeper. And that root your presence, your restraint becomes your power. Sixth, validation seeking. This is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous of them all, because it wears the mask of humility. It pretends to be open, but underneath, it is a hunger for control. The man who needs applause is controlled by the crowd. The man who needs to be liked will betray himself to stay loved. Machiavelli didn't need likes. He needed leverage. And so do you. Stand in front of a crowd and say something unpopular but true. Watch the silence. Feel the discomfort. Now ask yourself, can you hold it? Can you stand there, rooted in your own truth, without needing the room to agree with you? That test is the difference between power and performance. You must train yourself to be immune to praise, immune to silence, immune to backlash. Because when your emotional weather depends on the crowd, you're not a leader. You're a puppet. Seventh, underestimating. In every room, someone is invisible, and that person is your greatest test. Machiavelli said, "It is much safer to be feared than loved when you have to choose between the two." But fear cannot be built on arrogance. It must be built on awareness. When you dismiss someone too quickly, you reveal your own blindness. And blindness in public life is fatal. The intern, the assistant, the quiet one in the corner, the person you ignored because they didn't look like power, remember them. Because they remember you. And when the tables turn, and they always do, it is not your enemies who destroy you. It is the people you underestimated, who watched, learned, and waited. Never assume you know who holds influence. Never assume you're the smartest in the room. Assume nothing. Watch everything. So where does this leave us? In a world where public life is more visible than ever, Machiavelli's warnings are more urgent than ever. You don't need to be manipulative, but you must be strategic. You don't need to be feared, but you must be respected. You don't need to be perfect, but you must be aware. Every word you speak in public is a seed. Every reaction, a signal. Every silence, a decision. And the man who masters these subtleties becomes untouchable, not because he has no flaws, but because he knows when to reveal them and when to hold them. Now we arrive at the final layer. The layer where things get quiet but never simple. If you've come this far, it means you already understand something most people never will. Public life is a war of perception. And every gesture, every silence, every glance, every mistake, it all matters. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to be admired. He wrote it to be feared. Not because fear is power, but because understanding the truth of power is rare. And we are not here to be comfortable, we are here to be dangerously aware. You must never forget that public space is not just physical. It's philosophical. It's psychological. Every time you enter a room, a platform, a meeting, a stage, you enter a battlefield of symbols. And those who win are not always the most skilled, the most kind, or even the most intelligent. They are the most calculated, the most grounded, the most invisible when necessary. Machiavelli warned, the vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. If you want influence, you must master appearances. But if you want real power, you must know how to detach from them. There is a core question that should haunt you. Where am I giving away power without even knowing it? Not through failure, but through habit, through emotion, through unconscious behavior. We often think power is lost through dramatic events. But more often, it's lost in small, public moments of weakness. A need to be right, a flash of arrogance, a subtle plea for validation. These micro moments accumulate. And like Machiavelli said, the wise man does at once what the fool does at last. The wise recognize these traps early and eliminate them. Let's revisit the dynamic of emotional display. There's a myth today that says authenticity is always good. But Machiavelli would challenge that. He would ask you, authentic to what? To your emotions or to your mission? Because if your loyalty is always to your feelings, then your enemies will always know how to control you. You are authentic, yes, but you are also predictable. And predictability in public is suicide. The man who cannot regulate his state becomes a puppet of the crowd's reactions. This is why restraint is not repression. Restraint is power. You must cultivate the ability to feel everything and still choose your response. Not because you are fake, but because your mission cannot afford emotional leakage. Your legacy cannot be built on the shifting sands of mood. Machiavelli knew men must either be pampered or annihilated, which means there is no middle ground in public power. You either control the narrative or it controls you. Now think about overexplaining. How much of your communication is rooted in fear of being misunderstood? And what does that fear cost you? When you overexplain, you are not clarifying, you are negotiating your worth. You're trying to convince people not to misjudge you, when in reality their judgment is not your jurisdiction. Machiavelli respected the man who could lead without needing approval, because that man is clear. He moves without apology, and that movement creates gravity. What if you spoke less, but every word landed like a stone? What if you trained yourself to be comfortable with being misunderstood? What if you stopped trying to control the crowd and instead focused on controlling your frequency? That kind of presence is magnetic. It doesn't beg for attention. It commands it without trying. The fewer words you need, the more weight your voice carries. That is public power. Let's go deeper into the danger of mocking others. Why is it such a critical mistake? Because when you mock, you expose your own insecurity. You show that you need to diminish others to feel tall. But Machiavelli understood something most people don't. The best fortress which a prince can possess is the affection of his people. Affection is not earned by fear, it's earned by subtle dignity, by the ability to hold your power without flexing it. When you raise others in public, people feel safe around you, and safety breeds loyalty. But when you humiliate, even if it seems deserved, you create a fracture. You turn the moment into a performance, and performances always end. But respect built through restraint that has no expiration. The strongest man in the room is often the one who doesn't need to prove it, because his presence is felt before he ever opens his mouth. Now consider the danger of revealing too much of your plan. We live in a culture that celebrates transparency. But Machiavelli would remind us that mystery is leverage. The moment people know your entire blueprint, they begin to calculate. They begin to plan around you. And once you lose the element of surprise, you lose the upper hand. Public moves should be like magic tricks, precise, intentional, and always leaving people wondering, how did he do that? This is not about deceit, it's about discipline. You must learn to hold your vision close, tell only what is necessary, reveal only what serves the mission, and always leave space for doubt. Doubt in your enemies' minds, doubt in the minds of competitors, doubt in the minds of those who think they've figured you out. Because once they doubt what they know, you control the game. Let's talk again about public arguments. What is an argument really? It's a loss of sovereignty. It's when someone else provokes you to step out of your frame. Machiavelli would say, the promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. In other words, public commitments made in the heat of argument are rarely wise. They are emotional, reactive, and often regrettable. The man of power does not argue. He observes. He lets the other man exhaust himself. He lets the noise pass. And then he moves, quietly, decisively, without needing to explain. This is not weakness, it's supreme strength. The strength to not respond. Because your response, your energy, your words, those are currency. Spend them wisely, especially in public. And what of public validation? This is perhaps the most invisible danger of all, because it feels innocent, it feels human. But Machiavelli would ask you, can you stand alone in a room of critics and still know your worth? Because if you can't, you will always betray yourself when the pressure rises. You will always bend. You will always adjust your truth to please the crowd. The crowd is fickle. The crowd forgets. The crowd will crown you today and crucify you tomorrow. So if you build your identity on their cheers, you will also perish in their silence. Your public power must come from inner clarity, from a mission so deeply rooted that applause becomes irrelevant. When people feel that, they start to follow you not because you ask them to, but because they need to. Finally, do not underestimate, ever. In public, the most dangerous person is not the loud one. It's the one who listens, the one who watches, the one who waits. Machiavelli wrote, "The lion cannot protect himself from traps." The trap is often a person you dismissed, a person you mocked, a person you ignored. And one day they rise not just to power, but to vengeance. The wise man sees every person as a potential ally or a future threat. He treats the invisible with the same dignity as the visible. Not because he's afraid, but because he understands the long game. Power is not won in a day. It's won in decades. In how you treat people when you don't need anything from them. In how you carry yourself when no one seems to care. Because one day, all those people they will remember. And so we end where we began, with a warning. Machiavelli didn't write his philosophy for the comfortable. He wrote it for those brave enough to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The public sphere is not a place for naive hearts. It is a place for clear eyes, steady hands, and silent strength.